cutie, I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to The Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. If you're not new here, welcome back. Welcome to another cult meeting. On Wednesdays, I try to do a series that I call Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I read. This time, we're doing A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's a crazy one. I like crazy books though. It's another dystopian future book. You know I like those. A little heady, but that's okay. We can do it. We can expand our mind through intellectual challenges. And this book was a little bit of an intellectual challenge for me. There's a lot of references to Shakespeare, which is, for me, hard to understand because I haven't read it since high school. But that's okay. We're gonna learn together. Now this book is a little controversial. It has been banned in a few school districts across the United States, but only because there is a lot of adult activity scenes. It doesn't go into anything too graphically, like it's not too detailed, but there is a lot of promiscuity. It's something that is encouraged among the population, so it is a big part of the book. But again, nothing too graphic, just the ideas are presented. So, if you want to listen to my summary of A Brave New World and watch me do my makeup at the same time, stay tuned. Okay, so A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and this book came out in 1932. So this book starts with a group of students and they're going on a tour in some kind of biochemical laboratory. And I believe they're college, maybe high school, but you know, younger people. And over the main entrance of the building is the sign, Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center, and the World State motto, Community, Identity, Stability. Now it's the year AF 632, and it's this utopian society. Everybody's young, everybody's healthy, there's no disease. People do still die, usually like in their 60s, but their life is pretty much perfect up until then. They don't really die of like any particular disease. They just kind of die one day. They still look young, but you know, it's time for them to die. And this is because that human beings are no longer born in the same way as human beings are today. Instead of being born to a mother and father, they're manufactured in a lab, and they're manufactured perfectly. There's no such thing as having a mother or father anymore. In fact, the idea of like a family unit is actually kind of repulsive to people, and there's no such thing as monogamous love either. Now the tour guide shows the students, he's like, so this is where the alphas are bottled, and as well as the gammas and the deltas and epsilons. He also shows them the Bokanovsky process. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But it's basically where they can get 96 humans out of one egg. So kind of like twins, but multiple times. Now, once the embryos are decanted, he shows them what happens next. They are predestined and conditioned. They're decanted as social human beings, as either future sewage workers or future world controllers. Okay, I'm gonna let my skincare sit for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. So the guy taking these students on this tour says, now that's the secret to happiness, to being conditioned into the role that you have been designed to play, to wanting what you have and not wanting what you can't have. All their conditioning aims at that, to make people enjoy their unescapable social destiny. Then he shows them the room for decanting and the conditioning room for the Alpha Plus intellectuals. Then he shows them through another doorway. Above the door it says Infant Nurseries, Neo-Pavlovian Conditioning. Then he shows them through another door, and before they go into the door he says, okay, you have to be very quiet in here. And they go into the door and a nurse stands at attention. He says, what's the lesson today? And she says, elementary class consciousness. And in the room are just rows of cots. And on the cots are little children sleeping. Now, at the opposite end of the room was a speaker. And there was a very low, tender voice speaking. And I'm just going to read what it was saying because I want to get it just right. It was saying, all wear green, and Delta children wear khakis. Oh no, I don't want to play with Delta children, and Epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able to read or write. Besides, they wear black, which is such a beastly color. I'm so glad I'm a beta. Alpha children wear gray. They work much harder than we do because they are so frightfully clever. I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta because I don't work so hard. And then we are much smarter and better than gammas and deltas. Gammas are stupid. They all wear green, and delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with delta children. And epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able. So you get the idea. It's repeating over and over. Then the students and the man giving this tour, who's the director, they go out into the gardens to watch the children play. Now out in the garden, one of the 10 world controllers shows up. So a big head honcho guy. And he starts lecturing the students on why the world is the way it is. Everything is by design to keep people happy, to keep them working so that they can consume, which is going to keep them happy, so that they'll keep working, so that they can consume, so that they can be happy. And if all that fails, someone is still unhappy, if the conditioning and the bioengineering doesn't work out, there's always soma. Soma is a drug that people can take when they are feeling sad. It has no side effects, there's no hangover, and you take it and you go on these so crazy, fantastic trips in your mind around the world. And then when you come out of it, you're happy again. Then over the loudspeaker comes an announcement of a shift change. The day shift is getting off work and the evening shift is starting. And one of the people getting off their shift, her name is Lenina Crown. So she gets off her shift and she goes into the elevator and she goes up 17 floors to the girls' dormitory. In there, there's ladies, young women everywhere. They're bathing, it seems like they're all getting ready to go out for the evening. Everyone's kind of joking around and laughing and having a good time. Now Lenina goes to her little area of the dormitory where her locker is, and she runs into her friend Fanny. And Fanny asks, oh, who are you going out with tonight? And Lenina says, Henry Foster. And Fanny says, you're going out with Henry Foster again? she was kind of disappointed. She's like, you mean to tell me that you're still seeing him? And Lenina says, yeah. And Fanny's like, it's been 4 months since you've started seeing him. And what's worse is there hasn't been anybody but Henry. And Lenina admits, she's like, yeah, and I don't see why there should have to be. And Fanny was like, are you kidding me? She's like, you better be careful. She's like, it's bad form to go around with just one man. And she's like, besides, if the director found out, he would be furious. And Fanny's like, you know, you don't have to give him up completely. Just go out with someone else from time to time. She's like, I'm sure he's seen other girls, right? And Lenina's like, yeah. And Fanny's like, see, there you go. She's like, you ought to be a little more promiscuous. And Lenina kind of shook her head and she was just like, you know, lately I haven't really been feeling too keen on promiscuity. She's like, don't you ever feel that way, Fanny? And Fanny said, yes, of course, but you know, one's got to make an effort. One's got to play the game because, I mean, everyone belongs to everyone else. And Lenina said, you know what, Fanny, you're right, as usual. And Lenina was like, you know, I kind of actually like Bernard Marx. And Fanny was just like taken aback. She was like, are you serious? Bernard Marx? And Lenina's like, yeah, why not? She's like, after all, he's an alpha plus. And he asked me to go out to the Savage Reservation with him, and I kind of want to go. I think it would be cool. And Fanny's like, yeah, but his reputation. And Lenina's like, why should I care about his reputation? And Fanny's like, they say he doesn't like obstacle course. And Lenina's like, oh, that's just a rumor. Then Fanny said, and they say he spends a lot of time alone. And Lenina's like, well, if I go out with him, he won't be alone. Lenina's like, I don't understand why people are so mean to him. She's like, I think he's sweet. And Fanny's like, yeah, but he's so ugly. And Lenina's like, well, I kind of like the way he looks. Fanny is like, you know, they say when he was still in the bottle that someone accidentally poured alcohol into his blood surrogate, and that's why he's so stunted. And Lenina's like, that's ridiculous. And Fanny's like, one of these days, Lenina, you are gonna get into trouble. Now, just then, Lenina had to leave to meet Henry Foster, but not before she remembered to take her regulatory contraceptives. Now, over in the boys' dormitory, Henry Foster was talking to the assistant predestinator, and he was saying, oh, Lenina Crown, oh yeah, she's a great girl. I'm surprised you haven't had her yet. And the predestinator was like, you know what? Yeah, I'm surprised I haven't either. I'm gonna make sure and take care of that just as soon as I can. Now, on the opposite side of the changing room was Bernard Marx, and he was overhearing everything they were saying, and he was disgusted. He couldn't believe that they were talking about Lenina Crown like that, like she was a piece of meat. And, you know, what was even worse to him was that not only did men talk about Lenina and women in general like this, but that Lenina and other women thought of themselves in this way, as meat. Damn it, I forgot to put on my primer. Yeah, well. Then Henry Foster and the predestinator saw that Bernard was listening to them. And they were like, why so glum, Bernard? They're like, you know, what you need is some soma. And Bernard refused it. Bernard would rather be miserable and himself than someone else and happy. Then Bernard went and met up with his friend Helmholtz Watson. Now his profession was emotional engineer, and he wrote for newspapers. He composed feely scenarios, which are what they call movies, but there are sensory stimulation along with him. His superiors referred to him as able, but behind his back they would whisper to each other, perhaps a little too able. Now, while Bernard felt alone because of his physical differences, Helmholtz felt alone because of his superior intellect. He was very bored by, sports and bland lovers and communal activities. These things were very second best for him. He was more interested in mental challenges. And he was interested in just something else, but he didn't know what exactly. He just knew that normal activities of everyone else just wasn't doing it for him. Then Bernard had to go and get his paperwork straightened out so that he could take Lenina to the reservation. And he goes into the director's office, the same director that was taking everyone on that tour, and his boss. And he had already gotten his paperwork approved and signed by the World Controller's office, which was the director's boss. So the director pretty much had to approve this paperwork. And he goes, oh, he's like, the New Mexican reservation, huh? He's like, I went there with a girl once. He was like, it was like 25 years ago. He couldn't quite remember who the girl was, what she looked like, but he remembered that, they had gone out into the reservation hiking and were gonna have a picnic. And they both fell asleep. And when he woke up, the girl was gone. He had assumed that, she had woken up before him and made her way back to the hotel. So he goes back to the hotel, but she's not there. They sent a search party out looking for her, and they looked for about a day, but they never found her. And he says that, this was something that was very upsetting to him for a while. More upsetting than it should have been. He says, an accident like that could have happened to anyone, really. And what was there to get upset about? The social body was still intact, even though its cell components may have changed. He said that he still has nightmares about it. Then the director, he snaps out of his memory and he's like, well, Bernard, since you're here, I have something else I have to talk to you about. He says, I've been getting reports that in your off hours, you've been expressing, displeasure with society. He's like, this is a warning. If I get any more reports like that, I'm gonna send you off to Iceland. And he's like, good day, like, get out of my office. And Bernard leaves his office, but he's like kind of not worried about this at all. He feels like it's just an empty threat. He's like, they don't send people away for stuff like that. So then it was time for Bernard and Lenina to go on their trip. And Lenina was very excited. She'd never been to the Southwest before. And Bernard was one of the few men that she knew that was entitled to a permit to go out there. So this was, a unique opportunity for her. Now, when they get to the hotel, Lenina is very impressed. It's a very luxurious hotel. And Bernard tells her, he's like, out at the reservation, it's not like this. There's no running water. There's no television. So if you don't think that you can stand it, you can stay here and I'll just go. But Lenina's like, no, I want to see it too. She insisted that she could handle it. Then Bernard remembers that he left his perfume tap on at home. So he calls his friend Helmholtz and he asks him to go over to his place and turn it off because he's thinking about the bill that's running up. And Helmholtz is like, yeah, sure, I'll go over there. But while I have you on the phone, I want to tell you about something that happened at work today. He was like, the director was, speaking publicly to people that he was looking for someone to replace you. And of course, Bernard kind of freaks out. He's like, thinking to himself, he's like, wait a minute. He's like, the director just told me he was going to give me a second chance, and now he's not? Like, how dare he? He gets off the phone with Bernard, and he takes just a tiny bit of Soma to help him kind of calm down. Then a man shows up that's going to take him and Lenina out to the reservation. So they get into like a helicopter type machine, and they're flying out to the reservation, and they fly over a high wire tension fence that has 6,000 volts in it. And the pilot is telling them, you know, things here are different. He's like, people are still born to mothers and fathers. They still have religion here. There's no conditioning. The people that are born there are destined to die there. They still have marriage and families, and it's so backward. Now, one thing I couldn't quite get clear on at this part, I think they touched on it a little bit, but it seems, I was like, well, why was these reservations, these savage reservations, why were they the only ones like kept out of civilization? And the only, you know, why weren't they forced to be conditioned and acclimate to the New World Order? And the only thing that they really said was that society had felt that these people and this part of the land wasn't worth it. So I don't know, that was a little odd to me that it was just these people that weren't forced into this new way and kept there. Oh, obviously they were kept there to keep their traditions from spreading to civilized people. I don't know. Anyway, odd to me. They did touch on it, but I just thought it was kind of strange of a reason. Strange reason. I don't know. So they get flown into the reservation, they land, he's dropping them off at a rest house, and as he's getting back into the plane or helicopter, he tells them, you know, don't worry. He's like, these people are perfectly tame. They've had enough experience with the gas bombs to know they shouldn't play any tricks. So the pilot takes off, and then an indigenous man shows up, and he motions for them to follow him, and he takes them to a pueblo where there's going to be some kind of dance going on. So they watch this kind of ritual dance happen for a while, and then all of a sudden another man shows up and wants to talk to them, but he's obviously European. He has blonde hair and blue eyes, but he is dressed as the native people. And he says, "Good morning," in a kind of strange broken English. And he's like, "You're civilized, aren't you? You're from the other place." And they're both, Lenina and Bernard are both kind of like a little bit weirded out by this guy, but Lenina thinks he is hot. So Bernard asks him, he's like, "How did you get out here?" And he tells them that, you know, a long time ago, his mom showed up, you know, before he was born. She came there with a man. And Bernard's ears kind of perked up at this. And his mom, when she was out there with this man, had gone for a walk and fell and hit her head. And the men of his village had found her and brought her back there to be treated. But the man that she had come out there with never came to get her. He never came back. And the man's name, he said, was Tomakin. Now, Bernard's boss, the director, his first name was Thomas. Now, this man telling the story to Bernard and Lenina, he says his name is John. And John tells them, you know, this man must have flown back home from where they were from and just abandoned his mother out there. Her name was Linda. And John says, you know, he must be a very bad man. Who could, you know, just abandon someone like that? And he says, and so then I was born here. And he says, oh, would you like to meet my mother? And they're like, okay. Because, you know, mothers or just being born naturally is considered very icky. Now, when Linda sees Lenina and Bernard, she cries out, she's like, civilized people. And she bursts into tears. And she tells them all about what happened, about how she had gotten pregnant and then abandoned. She told them that, you know, the people had found her and brought her to their reservation. But her and her son were not exactly accepted. They were tolerated, but they were not really members of the community. In fact, they both suffered a lot of abuse at the hands of this tribe. Now, Linda tells them about a time when she gets jumped by all the women from the tribe because all of their men would come and visit her. And Linda, you know, being conditioned that this was okay, she couldn't understand why everyone hated her and her son. So then at this point, John and Bernard kind of step away from Lenina and Linda, who are still having a conversation, and they kind of start their own conversation. Now, John tells Bernard about, you know, kind of all the same abuses that he and Linda suffered, but he also tells him about a lot of good things, a lot of good memories, about how Linda had told him all about the other place and how the men of the village, the older men, taught him a lot about their customs and about how the world came to be and about gods and spirits. John also told Bernard that Linda had taught him how to read, and how this kind of gave him a little bit of pride, a way to hold up his head when the other boys of the village would tease him about his mother. One of the men who used to visit his mother on a regular basis, one time he brought him a very old book so that he could practice reading. And the book was the complete works of Shakespeare. John also told Bernard that he felt very lonely because he was very different than everybody else here. And Bernard confided in him that he felt different too because he was different than everyone in his community. Bernard, having put two and two together about who this young man's father was, and kind of plotting against his boss who wants to fire him, he invites John and his mother to go back to London with him. And John is ecstatic. He's like, I have dreamt of this my whole life. And he's like, don't you remember what Miranda said? And Bernard's like, who's Miranda?
Who's Deanna?
But John didn't answer. Now this part, again, was a little confusing for me. This part about Miranda, you would not understand what he was talking about because they never explain it. So I had to do a little research. And Miranda is a character from Shakespeare's The Tempest. And here John quotes Miranda, not explaining who she is. He just kind of looks off and he says, "Oh, brave new world." And then he goes to Bernard. He's like, "Are you married to her?" And Bernard's like, "Lenina? Married?" He's like, "What do you mean?" And John is like, married, like forever. And Bernard starts laughing and he's like, "Oh, no, we're not married." And John starts laughing too, but he's laughing because he's happy about this. And then John looks off and he's like, "Oh, brave new world. Oh, brave new world with such people in it." So Bernard goes and he makes all the arrangements to take John and Linda back to London with him. And he gets everything approved based on scientific observation. He's, telling his superiors that he wants to bring them back as a way to observe their reactions to civilization. Now, when they all get back to London, Bernard's boss asks Bernard to meet him in one of the laboratories. The boss, wants to confront Bernard on his unorthodox lifestyle, and he wants to do it in front of everybody. So Bernard, he goes to the lab and his boss is there, and when he shows up, his boss says, "Excuse me, everyone, excuse me." He's like, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but the security and stability of society is in danger." He's like, "This man, Bernard Marx, this Alpha Plus, who so much has been given to him, is a heretic and is conspiring against society by his unorthodox beliefs and sex life." And he's like, "And for this reason, I propose that we dismiss him, that we send him to an island." And then his boss kind of turns and folds his arms, looking at Bernard like, "What do you have to say about that?" And he says to Bernard, "Can you give me a reason why I shouldn't?" And Bernard says, "Yes, I have a reason." He's like, "Oh, really? What is it? Show me." And Bernard goes, "Okay." And he walks over to the door and he opens the door and he says, "Come on in." And in walks Linda. Now, Linda doesn't look like everyone else. She doesn't look like all the other women in London. She's had a rough life and it shows. She's in her 40s, but she's overweight. You can tell that she has born children and lines in her face. Anyway, she's not the typical beauty that these people are used to. And when she walks in, everyone is like, "Oh." And when she sees the director, she says, "Tomakin." And she goes running towards him and puts her arms around him. And he's like, "What is the meaning of this?" He's like, "Who are you? What is this, some kind of joke?" And everyone watching starts to kind of chuckle. And she says, "Don't you remember me?" She's like, "You made me have a baby and then you just took off." And everyone got real quiet. And this man, the director, Thomas, his face goes pale. And then Linda calls John, and John comes in the door. And when John sees Thomas, he says, "Father?" And everyone starts hysterically laughing. So the director ends up losing his position, and John becomes somewhat of a celebrity amongst the upper castes of London. Everyone is very curious about this man who grew up outside of civilization and who was born in such an unnatural way. And Bernard became John's guardian. And because of this, Bernard found himself for the first time in his life somewhat of a important person. There was no more teasing about him getting, alcohol poisoning as an embryo. And everybody wanted to be invited to his parties so that they could meet John. And he could also have any woman that he wanted, especially if they thought, they might get invited to one of these parties. And even though Bernard's position in life had gotten better, he was still very critical of society. And, people, they would listen politely so that they could, get invited to one of his parties. But behind his back, they would be like, that guy, he's gonna have a bad end someday. Now, Bernard had to report to a man named Mustafa Mond, who was one of the world controllers. Because remember, all of this is supposedly in the name of science. this observation of John and how he was reacting to society. And Bernard would have to, you know, write up these reports and send them to Mr. Monde. And Mr. Monde could still kind of sense Bernard's disdain for society. And he felt he needed to be taught a lesson. Now, one night, Bernard asked Lenina to take John to a feelie. Bernard had an appointment to go to, and he wanted to make sure that John was entertained while he was gone. And Lenina was more than happy to oblige because she liked John and she really wanted to know what it would be like to spend an evening with him, you know, alone. Now, these feelies or movies engaged all of your senses. There were smells and physical sensations that were conducted through the seat you sat in. So if someone on screen kissed, you felt it on your lips. Now, the film was about a girl that gets kidnapped and she gets rescued. And there are a lot of adult scenarios in the film. And as a viewer, you're feeling everything that the actors are feeling. Now, after the movie, Lenina, you know, she's all charged from this film, which is what they're designed to do. And she starts kind of trying to get close to John a little bit as they're leaving the theater, you know, holding onto his arm, stuff like that. And John, he is liking Lenina. He likes Lenina and he's attracted to her, but he feels that doing anything with her outside of marriage would be wrong. And he tells Lenina, he's like, you know, I don't think you should be watching movies like that. But Lenina's like, you know, I don't know what the big deal is. I thought it was a good movie. And so they get into a taxi and they go to take Lenina home. And Lenina's excited because she's thinking, okay, tonight's the night. It's gonna happen. So when they get to her place, they get out of the taxi and Lenina is like getting her stuff together and she turns around expecting to see John there next to her, but he's actually getting back into the cab and saying goodnight. And Lenina is like, little thing is heartbroken. She's like, are you serious? As he pulls away, she's just like, now at Bernard's next party, John refused to come out. He'd kind of caught on that Bernard was using him as like this little sideshow to parade around and to climb the social ladder. Lenina had come to the party with the Arch Community Songster of Canterbury or something like that, some sort of important person. And she was excited to go to the party because she thought she was going to see John again. And she had decided that, yeah, John, she likes John more than any other man. So all the guests were terribly upset when Bernard refused to come out. They were upset, one, because they don't get to see the savage, and two, because, you know, they had been nice to Bernard, this heretic that they don't really like, but they're being nice to him so that they can go to his parties and see the savage. And they felt a little like tricked, like Bernard had just said these things that John was going to be there just to get them to his party. So everyone ends up leaving the party early and Bernard is left feeling embarrassed. Now, back at Mustafa Mond's office, he was reading a report titled A New Theory on Biology. And he writes at the top of the report, not to be published. Author will be kept under supervision, possible transfer to the Marine Biological Station of St. Helena, or something like that. Now, Monde had actually really liked the report, but felt that it might decondition some of the minds of the higher castes, that it might make them lose faith in happiness as the sovereign good. And though he actually thought the paper was true, he just didn't think it was a good idea to publish it. Now the next morning, John and Bernard had a little bit of an argument. John told Bernard that he's like, you know, I liked you better back at the reservation where you spoke honestly and openly with me. And Bernard was like, well, I spoke openly and honestly back then because I was unhappy then. And now I'm finally happy. And John was like, well, you know, I would rather be unhappy and honest than have this kind of fake happiness that you have going on here. Lenina had become a little depressed because she felt that John didn't like her back. And talking to her friend Fanny, she was telling her all about it. And Fanny was like, didn't get it. She was like, if you want a man, take him. That's what she said. She's like, if you want a man, just take him. And Lenina was like, you know what, you're right. I'm gonna have John. So she goes to his place where he stays with Bernard. And when he opens the door, she says, hello, John. She walks in all sultry. And she says, you don't seem happy to see me. And John says, not happy. He's like, I am very happy to see you. And he falls on his knees and he starts kissing her hand and telling her how wonderful she is. And of course, she's very happy about this. And so she goes to lean in to kiss him. And when he realizes what's about to happen, he gets to his feet, he scurries away from her, and he's like, you know, I like you, but we're not married and we can't do anything about that. He's like, so I need to find a way to prove that I'm worthy of you. Back home, we had marriage. They don't have that here. And Lenina's like, why is that necessary? And he's like, to show you how much I love you. He's like, you know, if we're gonna do anything, we really should be married. And Lenina just doesn't get it. She doesn't understand. She goes up to him, she grabs him by the wrist, and she's like, listen, do you like me or do you not like me? And John says, more than anything. And she's like, oh, well, why didn't you just say so? And then she starts getting undressed. And John is like, oh no. And she goes up to him, undressed. She puts her hands on his shoulders. She's like, put your arms around me. But he grabs her by the wrists and he thrusts her away from him. And his disposition completely changes. He becomes very aggressive and calling her terrible names. And he pushes her to the ground and tells her to get out of his sight. And Lenina has never seen a man react like this. She's terrified. And she runs to the bathroom and locks herself in there. And meanwhile, John is pacing up and down in front of the bathroom door. And he's like reciting Shakespeare, a lot of Romeo and Juliet. John's a little bit of a drama queen, in my opinion. Now, Lenina, still in the bathroom with the door locked, is wondering to herself how in the heck she is gonna get out of this situation. And she hears the phone ring and John answer it, and there's apparently some kind of emergency. So John leaves, and when Lenina is sure that he's gone, she makes her escape. Now the call that John had got was that his mother was in the hospital. Ever since they had gotten back to London, his mother was constantly taking soma, like way beyond what the normal person would take. and now it was killing her. So John goes to Park Lane Hospital for the Dying, and he sits next to her bed, and he just sits there with her crying, and suddenly she can't breathe and she dies. So he stays by her side for a while after she's gone, and he cries. And the staff is very weirded out by this. They can't understand why he's getting so emotional over somebody dying. So he leaves and he takes the elevator down, and when he gets off of the elevator, there's this group of people. They are in line for their daily soma ration after work. And he's so consumed with his grief, he doesn't take a whole lot of notice of what's going on, and he kind of starts, just kind of shouldering his way through the crowd. Now, after being elbowed a few times in the ribs and a few nasty comments, he kind of snaps out of his daze and he realizes what he's in the middle of here. He starts thinking to himself that these people are disgusting, that they're maggots. And he thought to himself, he's like, I thought I was coming to a brave new world, but it's repulsive. He's thinking to himself, he's like, these people are slaves and they don't even know it. And then it becomes very clear to him what he's got to do. And all of a sudden he yells out, "Stop!" He's like, "Don't take that stuff. It's poison for your body and your soul." He's like, "Throw it all away." And when the crowd heard him say, "Throw it all away," they did not like this. They got very angry. He's like, "I've come to bring you freedom." And then somebody in the crowd was like, "Okay," and picks up the phone. Now the call was made to Bernard. This person that picked up the phone was somebody that Bernard knew, and he called him and was like, "Hey, you might want to get down here. Your friend John is going mad." Now, when Bernard arrives, John is still yelling, and he's like, "But do you like being slaves?" He's like, "Don't you want to be free?" And they're all just like kind of staring at him with this stupid blank look on their face. And he's like, "Fine, you don't understand, I'll make you understand." And he grabs all the soma and he throws it out the window. Now Bernard brought his friend Helmholtz with him to the scene. John and Helmholtz had become pretty close. And Helmholtz kind of thought the situation was pretty funny. But when the crowd closed in on John, Helmholtz jumped to action and he tried to help John, and he started fighting people and punching them in the face. But then the cops showed up with gas masks on, and they started spraying soma vapor into the air, and everyone became kind of wobbly and unsteady on their legs, and they all kind of like tumbled into a heap on the ground. And then we hear a voice come over the loudspeaker, that same kind of soft, tender voice, and it's saying, "Friends, friends, what's the matter? Why are you acting like this? Why aren't you full of love and good and peace?" And this calms everybody down. And by the end of this scene, everyone is hugging each other and loving each other, and it's all so beautiful. But the police take John, Helmholtz, and Bernard into custody, and they're ushered into the controller's office. Then the resident world controller of Western Europe comes in, and he goes up to each one of them and he shakes their hand. And when he shakes John's hand, he says, "So, Mr. Savage, it seems that you don't really like civilization." And John is like, "No, I don't." Now here there's a lot of philosophical talk between John and the world controller, Mr. Mond. And there's a lot of references to Shakespeare. And this goes on for a while. And it's interesting. But in the end, what ends up happening is the controller tells John that everyone is happy, and everyone is happy because of the way that things are done. They're happy because they get what they want. And they're happy because they never want what they can't get. And this is the secret to stability. The fact that John was trying to even explain liberty to them was laughable because they could never understand it. And this, again, was the key to society stability. Bernard and Helmholtz end up getting sent to separate islands to live out the rest of their life with people who have the same type of heretical ideas, and they would continue to do the same work that they've always done, but there they wouldn't be able to spread their ideas amongst the general population. But John was allowed to stay in civilization. The controller wanted to continue on with scientific observation and the experiment. But John decided that he did not want to be an experiment anymore. And he decided that he was going to run away. He didn't know where. He just wanted to run away somewhere where he could be alone. Now the book doesn't say exactly how, but somehow John ends up living out in a forest in a lighthouse, and he spends his day gardening, hunting small game, and engaging in purification rituals. And his goal is to become completely independent of civilization. Now, one day while he was practicing one particularly brutal purification ritual, 3 young men stumble upon him, and they have no idea what they're looking at. They are shocked and they don't know what to do, so they just leave. But 3 days later, reporters show up. Now the first one to find him startles John, and he says, "Good morning, Mr. Savage. I'm a representative of Hourly Radio." And John is like, "What do you want?" And the reporter shoves a microphone in his face and he goes, "Everyone wants to know what you're doing. Why did you decide to leave London?" And of course, we're all crazy to know about the whip. "And what do you think of the civilized girl?" And John, he grabs the reporter, turns him around and kicks him in the tuchus and tells him to get out of there. And the reporter runs off, and within 8 minutes, there's a news story out on the streets of London, and the headline reads, "Hourly Radio Reporter Kept by Mystery Savage." Now, not long after that, 4 more reporters show up, and they're met with even more violence. Now, after that, John was left for a while in peace, but soon enough, the helicopters started coming around with reporters taking pictures hanging out of the helicopters, and John would shoot bow and arrows at them, and usually the arrow would pierce the floor of the cabin, and this would scare the reporters away. So then after this, the helicopters would still come around, but they kept a very respectful distance, and John would just ignore them, and then they would usually just go away. Now, from time to time, John would think about Lenina and about how much he had wanted her and still did, and then he would feel guilty about it, and he would give himself a purification beating. Now, one of these times that he was doing this, it became particularly intense and brutal. And while he was doing this, he didn't know it, but the whole time there was a Feely director in the bushes filming the whole thing. 12 days later, The Savage of the Surrey was released in all of the first-class Feely palaces in Western Europe. I'm assuming Surrey was the area that he lived in. Not exactly sure on that. But the effects of the film were felt immediately. On the afternoon that followed the evening of the release of the film, John's solitude was broken by a swarm of helicopters. I feel like I need to put this hood up to make it look more futuristic, more dystopian future. What do you think? Now the helicopters started landing and people were getting out and they started surrounding John. They were clapping and clicking their cameras and throwing peanuts. And the numbers were increasing by the dozens. And pretty soon there were hundreds of people there. And he started screaming, "Go away, what do you want with me?" And they all started laughing because the ape had spoken. And they all started saying, "The whip, we want to see the whip." Or "We want the whip, we want the whip." And John's like, fine. And he goes and he grabs his whip, but he threatens them with, and he's like, "Go away." They all start chanting, "We want the whipping stunt." And they start yelling, "Whip, whip, whip." And just then another helicopter lands and it's Lenina. And she sees John and she stretches her arms toward him and she's crying. And when John sees her, for some reason, the rage that he's feeling towards these people and their taunts gets redirected at Lenina, and he attacks her with his whip. The crowd, seeing this, starts gathering around to watch him beat her. They're fascinated with the horror of pain, since it's something that they've never experienced. And because of their conditioning for cooperation, they start joining in and they start beating each other. Now this group beating went on until after midnight when the last helicopters left. And then John realized what he had done, and he's very upset, obviously. He can't believe what he's done. He's like, "My God," he starts praying, "What have I done?" Now the next time that the helicopters show up, there's even more of them. People are very excited after the previous night's orgy of atonement had been described in all of the papers. They jump out of the helicopters and they're like, "Mr. Savage!" But he doesn't answer. So they go running into his lighthouse and they're like, "Mr. Savage!" And then they see feet dangling from the ceiling. He'd hung himself. The end. That's the end of A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Whew, my goodness. That was not the story I was expecting at all. It left me feeling slightly disturbed in a way. I guess because, you know, I feel bad for John. This book was interesting. I'm glad I read it. It's just not what I thought it was gonna be. I thought it was gonna be more like 1984, where the government there used, you know, fear and intimidation to keep people in line. But in this book, they used happiness to keep people in line, which I found a very unique turn on the idea of government overreach and control. But again, this book, I can understand why maybe they don't allow it in some schools anymore. It's also the type of book that has a lot of references to other literature like Shakespeare. But if you're not familiar with those references, you're not going to understand what they're talking about because they don't explain it, like with the whole Miranda thing.
Who's Deanna?
And I thought of myself as a slightly well-read person, but I haven't read Shakespeare since high school. And yeah, I had to look up a lot of stuff. That's okay. It expanded my mind. Anyway, so yeah, that is Brave New World. I enjoyed it overall. I enjoyed the book. I'm glad I read it. I do think it's something that once you're an adult, you should read. If you've read this book, let me know. And let me know your thoughts on it. Let me know your interpretation. And let me know if you liked this video by giving it a like. It helps me decide what kind of videos to make, and it lets me know you care. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you won't miss the next Beauty and the Bibliophile. In our next video, we're going to be doing something fun, something Disney, something lighthearted, so we can take a little brain break. And I will see you in the next video. Bye! And the world state motto, which is identity, community, stability. Then he shows them the place where to keep them working so that they can't. Now, his profession was emotional engineers, and the people that die there are destined to, they've had enough experience with the gas bombs to know that they shouldn't play. And then an indigenous, and he says to Bernard, he's like, and John actually becomes somewhat of a sort of, and all of a sudden he yells out, all of a sudden, but there they wouldn't be able to spread their disease ideas. We want the whipping stuff. Today we will be